Hello, the topic today is Beethoven's Cello Sonata number 2, Opus 5, number 2 in G minor. It's a piece that he wrote in 1796. It appeared in Vienna from the publisher Arturia the next year in 1797. It's a fascinating work because with these early cello sonatas, Beethoven found a niche that he could exploit himself. He could find his own creative space. He had written before this some piano trios, piano sonatas. Those were well-established genres that had been tried by Mozart and Haydn and many others. But the modern cello sonata, or what we recognize as the modern cello sonata, was really the invention of Beethoven, starting in 1796. Before Beethoven wrote these, if you were a cellist, even a virtuoso cellist, there were basically two types of music, chamber music, that you could use. One was a type of music in which the cello simply doubled the bass line as part of the continuo section. The other, in which the cello emerged as a soloist, was a type of chamber music in which the cellist was given virtuosic material and was accompanied in turn by other instruments playing a supporting role. The idea of a modern sonata with two musicians, in this case a cellist and a pianist, each of whom fully participated in the thematic material, the development of motivic material, the exchange of ideas. This was a modern invention. And Beethoven is the one who seems to have come up with it. It's interesting that he seized on the cello to do this. One reason might be because there really weren't any precedents. Haydn had not written cello sonatas with piano, and Mozart had not either. Mozart, of course, had written violin sonatas. Haydn wrote a fair amount of music for violin as well, but the idea of the cellist emerging as a soloist, that's something new. So in 1796, Beethoven set out from Vienna, accompanied by one of his aristocratic patrons. This was Prince Karl Lichnowsky. And they went first to Prague, then on to Dresden and Leipzig. Then the prince went back to Vienna, and Beethoven continued by himself on to Berlin. Now, Lichnowsky had arranged all this sort of in parallel to what he had done a few years before with another composer, and that was none other than Mozart. And the purpose of going to Berlin was to have an audience with the King of Prussia. At the time, that was Frederick William II. And Frederick William II was a cellist. That was his preferred instrument. He surrounded himself with his court musicians, with a number of prominent cello virtuosi, including two French brothers, Jean-Louis and Jean-Pierre Duport, who were in his employ. Also, another cellist by the name of Boccherini was writing music for the king. Boccherini, however, was sending it in from Spain. He never quite made it to Berlin, but he was hired by the king nevertheless, or commissioned to write a fair amount of chamber music, which he did. So Beethoven arrives in Berlin. He has an audience with the king, and he understood that he needed to write something that would be cellistic. So he's got to write something that involves the cello. Why? Because there are these spectacular French cello virtuosi. The king is a cellist. And he came up with the idea of writing these two cello sonatas. Now, a little bit about this king and his history. He was the nephew of Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was known as Der Alte Fritz. The old Fritz was a so-called enlightened monarch. He really was a military tactician, a soldier king who won all sorts of wars and battles against the Austrians and the Poles and others. And he put Prussia on the map really as a political force to be reckoned with, Prussia being the northern regions of what is now Germany. Frederick the Great, it turns out, was also a serious musician. He was a flutist, and not just a performer, but a composer. He wrote about 20 or 30 flute concerti. He surrounded himself with some of the most famous musicians of the time, including Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, one of J.S. Bach's sons. It was Frederick the Great who received J.S. Bach in Potsdam in 1749, and he gave Bach the so-called royal theme, which Bach then took, and that became the foundation of the musical offering. A wonderful, almost thesaurus-like display of counterpoint for which Bach was celebrated. Now, Frederick the Great could also be a kind of ruthless monarch, and in 1777 he issued a rather unusual proclamation. He was concerned about his subjects consuming too much coffee, and that he did not have control of the coffee trade, so he prohibited coffee drinking. And in his proclamation, he made a point of saying that many great battles had been won by soldiers who drank beer, and he expected his subjects to drink beer instead of coffee. He wasn't able to clamp down, and of course the Berliners became coffeeholics just like the rest of us. It was also Frederick the Great who said, being influenced by the Enlightenment, that he did not require his subjects to believe in God. He was sort of a deist, but he did expect them to obey the orders of the corporals in his army. Now, his nephew Frederick William II, the dedicatee of this wonderful sonata of Beethoven, had a totally different personality. He did share with his uncle his love for music. Frederick William II was a serious cellist. He had begun actually his musical career, such as it was, with the viola da gamba, and then he switched to cello as the older gamba was falling more and more out of favor. We're told that Frederick William II spent at least 2 hours a day with his instrument. We're told also that when he was off on his military campaigns, that he was accompanied by a string quartet, which is quite an image to imagine him sitting in a tent somewhere on a battlefield, listening to string quartets before his army goes off to battle. But we have that on pretty good authority. Frederick William II was also a patron of the arts, apart from his interest in music. He was the one who finished the Brandenburg Gate, Brandenburger Tor, which is one of the, of course, iconic landmarks of the city of Berlin. When Beethoven arrived with his G minor cello sonata and also his F major cello sonata, that's the Opus 5, number 1, and the G minor is number 2, so there are a pair of these. He presented them to the king and played them, presumably, with the king's, one of the king's cellists, one of the Duport brothers. These are pieces that are written in a particularly grand style. And I want to point out just a few features quickly. The first movement begins with a long, slow introduction, and that slow introduction has now this descending scale with what we call dotted rhythms, the yam, ta-tam, ta-tam, was basically a musical metaphor for the regal style, for royalty. And it goes back eventually to the French Baroque in the 17th century and to another court, and that is the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, at Versailles. Louis XIV loved opera, and he had a composer, an Italian composer, Lully, L-U-L-L-I, who became a French citizen. Lully, he swapped the I for a Y, so it's L-U-L-L-Y. And he composed about a dozen or so operas for Louis XIV. They were performed in a theater or an opera house, and they always began with an overture in a very slow, sober style that featured these dotted patterns, yam, da-dum, da-dum. And this came to represent the presence or the arrival of the king into the hall, the king establishing himself in his royal box ready to view the music drama that would follow. Fast forward to the 1790s, and Beethoven was using these dotted rhythms whenever he wanted to invoke the high style. Another more famous example, the Pathetique Sonata that he writes for piano. Has them as well, and that's because he's writing in a pathetic style, not pathetic in the sense that we mean it today, something that's kind of trivial, but pathetic, pathos, something that's reaching for the deeper emotions. So the slow movement a slow introduction of this first movement is filled with these dotted note figures, and that's a sign of the presence of the king. There are a couple other things he does to invoke this high style. It really is a kind of tragic style. And the real takeaway from this Opus 5 number 2, these two movements, is that they really are opposite sides of the same coin. The first movement, including the slow introduction, is in a tragic style, very dissonant, with a lot of surprises, a lot of rest, sudden interruptions. The second movement, on the other hand, is in a comic style. So it's tragedy juxtaposed with comedy. And it's these two totally different styles that have to be conveyed in performances. And it's as if Beethoven is sort of leaving it up to us to decide which one we prefer. The dissonance level is a telltale feature of Beethoven. When he writes something like this, or a couple bars later, these are all dissonant chords. And you know, the age-old rule about dissonances had been that, you know, when you have a dissonant chord, ordinarily it's supposed to resolve into the next chord. You're supposed to resolve the dissonance into a consonance. Beethoven doesn't do that. He follows this dissonance with another one, and another one. And then a step higher, same thing, dissonance, dissonance, and dissonance, followed by a rest. It's very fascinating the way he uses these rests, these moments of silence, which gives us just a bit of fleeting time to process the dissonance level and to imagine what might be coming next. All right. So those are some ideas about the first movement. Its length, magisterial length, the dotted rhythms that suggest the regal style, the heightened dissonance, the rapid changes in dynamics, which create an idea, a sense of drama or conflict, which is only resolved at the end of the first movement in a coda, where we finally get something like this. Which is quite a surprise because it's in the major instead of the minor. And it's fortissimo, and it has this sort of driving momentum to it. That now sets up the Rondo, the second movement, which is in a totally different style. Etc., etc. This is a piece that plays on the idea of beginnings and endings. It doesn't really start in the key in G major, but away in C major, and then pivots, and then confirms G major. So it's, as if to say, well, the key is really G major, and so forth. That becomes a refrain in a rondo, which we hear several times through the course of this wonderful movement. The Perhaps the most interesting return of it is maybe about 2/3 of the way through the piece, where it reappears in the wrong key, in the key of D flat major. So we have before it finally finds its way back to G major, the tonic. It's sort of an inside musician's joke, and it goes to the jocularity of this movement and the sort of popular style. This is not high tragedy, this is high comedy. So you put it all together, and you have this two-movement sonata of Beethoven. And the other final point to make about it is that now for the first time, Beethoven is writing a sonata with a cello part, which is becoming more or less the equal of the piano part. Even though this is a piano sonata with obbligato cello, both instrumentalists are very, very busy. And, these are demanding parts, not easy music to play by any stretch at all. So Beethoven is going to aim toward the idea of parity between the instruments, that in a chamber music sonata like this, both musicians are fully participating in the exchange of ideas, the development of themes, the overall structural outlines of the piece, and so forth. And with that, we have the invention of the modern cello sonata, and Beethoven will be followed by all those composers who continue to experiment with this wonderful genre. So after he performed this for the king, and we can only imagine what the king thought, presuming that Beethoven performed it on a forte piano, which was, in those days, still a rather fragile instrument. We can imagine Beethoven extracting from the instrument these dynamic changes in high drama. I mean, the king must have thought that this musician was destroying his instrument. Beethoven returned to Vienna. The king died within a year, but not before sending Beethoven apparently a gold snuff box filled with the currency of the time. So Beethoven was well rewarded, which was the reason to have the audience with the king in the first place. So then we have Opus 5, number 2, 1796, second of the 5 cello sonatas of Beethoven, and I hope you enjoy the performance.